Well, thanks, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here and to take part in what is a really great project. And if I may say, because my situation is a little different from those who have spoken before, I think it is a great pleasure to discuss these issues in front of John Howard himself. I was a Commonwealth official for the period we're talking about, and much of the opportunity I had to learn about the things I'm going to speak about came about because of the opportunities that Mr Howard and his government gave me to work on some very interesting issues. I've got a slightly different time period from others. Tom has been kind enough to let me go back to 1996 and the election and through to 2000. And in order to discuss defence policy in that time, I'd need to ask you to exercise some imagination and to go back to an era in which national security was not a phrase that was used by every Australian political leader every half hour. It was part of the deal, of course, but it had nothing like the prominence in our national political conversation that it's had, roughly speaking, since 9/11. And part of that is also to ask you to go back and imagine a time in which John Howard's political leadership was not largely defined by his role as a national security leader. Because it seems to me that if you look at the way in which John Howard's political leadership evolved after East Timor, after Tampa and after 9/11, national security and the leadership on national security became absolutely central to the way in which he conceived and exercised his leadership nationally and was seen by the country as a leader. And national security leadership is different from other kinds of political leadership. It works in different ways. There are different expectations. Now, whereas back in the period we're talking about, up until 1999 at least, John Howard was not seen primarily as a national security leader, and it didn't have anything like the priority, the prominence that it has had in his in the later parts of his prime ministership. It's also worth bearing in mind that by the time he became prime minister in 1996, the politics of national security had changed very significantly. Because, and I'm not entirely impartial on this issue because I worked for the other side, he succeeded the Hawke-Keating years in which Labor had, one might say at last, established its credentials in national security. It was no longer an issue that the coalition, that the Conservative side of politics owned as of right. Labor had established itself as a responsible and effective manager of the alliance, and Washington accepted that. It had established itself as an effective articulator and implementer of defence policy, a concept of defence of Australia, a self-reliance, a framework of alliances, a clear, well-understood policy construct, and it had shown itself willing to deploy the ADF on operations, which we now sort of take for granted. But it's worth remembering that even as late as 1990, 1991, when the decision was made to deploy forces to what became Operation Desert Storm, the shadow of Vietnam still loomed very large over the thought of using the ADF in operations. And it was Labor that had moved past that. And of course, in particular, the person most closely identified with Labor's achievements in this was Kim Beazley, who John Howard faced as Leader of the Opposition. So this was not a policy area in which John Howard could naturally assume he owned it. Nor was it Howard's natural area of strength as he became Prime Minister. He had not established his credentials as a national leader, as a political leader, on the basis of his work in national security or foreign affairs, unlike, for example, his predecessors as a Liberal leader, Malcolm Fraser and Andrew Peacock. Both were people with very strong credentials in the foreign affairs and national security area. John Howard was known for his work on economic policy, and that were his credentials. But he was also, of course, a traditionalist, and that meant, amongst other things, having a traditional, visceral, instinctive enthusiasm for defence and enthusiasm for the alliance, or for alliances. I'm going to say, though, I think it seemed to me at the time that his enthusiasm for the alliances was not based on the kind of very emotional love of America that you saw with many figures on the Labor side, including people like Beazley, whose enthusiasm for the alliance was partly a reflection of it and a love of America as a political system and as a society. In fact, I detected in Howard early on something of the coolness towards the United States of the true empire loyalist. of people who, I'm speaking of my parents' generation. I know this attitude. That somehow the Americans were just a little bit, weren't quite us. They were a little bit brash, and of course in those early days, this was reinforced by the fact that the American president he was dealing with was one William Jefferson Clinton, for whom I would say it was not a marriage made in heaven, not very similar kinds of politicians or people. And I think it's fair to say that Howard came into office with no very big policy agenda in defence. He accepted the construct of defence policy which had evolved back through the Fraser years from 1976 White Paper through the defence policy processes of Labor, which were based on one fundamental principle, that is the purposes for which Australia's defence capabilities were designed and built was a direct defence of Australian territory independently from the sorts of attacks that we might face from our immediate neighbours, Indonesia. It's a long story as to why that was our posture, but that was the basic foundation of Australian defence policy. That was what we were designing and building our armed forces to do. Forces designed for that could be used for other purposes, and were, but they were designed solely for that task. And we would accept limits on what we could do elsewhere, limits on what we could do beyond the defence of Australia, in the Middle East or in the immediate neighbourhood or wherever, that were imposed by the scale of forces and the nature of forces that we designed for that narrow purpose. And it seemed to me at the time, I think it's borne out by the record, that the Howard government in its first term accepted that framework. So when, as he did, and very spectacularly, he exempted defence from the very stringent budget cuts that were imposed on every other portfolio around Canberra in those first couple of budgets, that was not an expression of a very specific policy idea that Australia had strategic challenges it needed to meet and we needed more defence capability to do it. It was more, I think, an expression of a general attitude that defence was very important and needed to be nurtured. Nurtured, yes, but not coddled, because the other thing that was very distinctive about the Howard approach to defence policy early on was that he and his colleagues, including his First Minister Ian McLaughlin, were tough on defence. The kind of, I'm going to allow myself to say, indulgence of defence that we saw once defence and the ADF in particular and the Army in particular had reasserted its place in Australian national life after East Timor. That kind of indulgence of defence was not there in those early years. The most important thing the Howard government did in its first couple of years was the Defence Efficiency Review, which was a very significant run-through of defence. I was there at the time, I felt it. And it was accompanied by a certain scepticism about military advice, and official advice, I might say. But there was no sense in which Howard in those early days was soft on defence. So there's a sense there of conservatism and tradition and stability. But there were big shifts underway nonetheless. 4 big things were underway in the mid-90s, which were undermining the foundation of the defence policy which Howard inherited and to which he was called upon to respond. It's a big subject, but those 4 big shifts are, first of all, the transformation of the Southwest Pacific from an area in which we broadly believed it was all going well to an area in which we broadly understood that it was not going at all well. And so a bigger focus on what was required of Australian policy and what was potentially required of Australian Defence Forces in supporting Australia's interests in the Southwest Pacific. The second was the global trend towards more active use of armed forces to intervene in trouble spots, the whole peacekeeping thing. Australia had been involved in Namibia, Iraq, of course, in 1991, Somalia, Rwanda, Cambodia, MINURSO, the Western Sahara. This was a big pattern, and it was becoming a big part of the way we thought about the role of armed forces. That was the second thing, and that was global, not just in our region. The third was a long-term shift in the balance of technological advantage away from Australia as the capabilities in our region improved. The defence posture which had been developed in the 70s and 80s in the post-Vietnam era very heavily presupposed a continuing version of Hilaire Belloc's famous line that always remember that we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. We presupposed that we would have decisively better military technology than other countries in our region indefinitely. And in the mid-90s, it was starting to become clear that just wasn't true. And fourthly, a kind of a shadow, no more than a shadow, a distinct sense, by the time you get to 1996 and 1997, that Asia is changing because of the rise of China. Already in the mid-90s, we understood that China's rise was changing the way Asia worked, was changing the relationships between major powers, and raised the prospect that Australia could find itself, either by itself or in support of the United States, in a conflict with a major power which had seemed unthinkable in the decades after Vietnam. All of those four trends tested the way we thought about defence of Australia as a foundation for our policy, tested the judgments we made about the kinds of capabilities we need, and in particular tested the assumption that the forces we developed for the defence of Australia would be enough to do whatever else we would need to do. There were questions about whether those four changes might require us to build forces that could do more things beyond the defence of Australia than had been contemplated. The second big shift that was underway was much more close to home, so to speak, but very real, and that is that the defence budget was going down a hole. Defence spending in Australia had been static in real terms for a decade by 1996. The good news was neither government took a peace dividend out of us, which happened to almost every other Western military after the end of the Cold War. The bad news is that while the defence budget was flat in real terms, the costs of delivering the capabilities we were delivering was going up, if I remember the number correctly, over that decade by an average of 2.65% in real terms. So our budget was stable and our costs were increasing, therefore our outputs were decreasing. And that was producing a long-term decline in capability, and although things like the Defence Efficiency Review were designed to remedy that by getting more capability for every dollar, the easy reforms had already been done. So those two factors required the Howard government in those early years to go about a much more radical rethink about defence policy than I think they had come into office expecting to do. There was a need for a new approach, both to the way in which we defined what we wanted our armed forces to do and how much we were willing to spend on it. The first step of that was a major policy document which I think has, this is partly pride of authorship, which I think has a less significant place in the history of Australian defence policy than it deserves, and that is the 1997 Strategic Policy Review, which was the companion document to the Foreign Policy White Paper that Michael mentioned. And they were prepared together and published within a few days of one another, and were very much intended and presented as a pair. And the Strategic Policy Review, very much driven by Ian McLaughlin as Minister, set out a wider concept of Australia's strategic interests and objectives. In fact, it was the first point in which the concentric model of Australia's strategic interests and objectives, which has been the foundation of articulations of Australian defence policy ever since, it was the first point at which that was really clearly set out. And it abandoned the assumption that whatever capabilities we developed for the defence of Australia was going to be good enough to do those other things that were identified in that concentric model of interests and objectives. It said we need to do more than just assume that. We need to make sure we are developing capabilities that can do more than just defend Australia. It was actually, in terms of the conceptual foundation to defence policy, it was a very radical departure from what had gone before. And it was recognised that that conceptual point needed to be reflected in a comprehensive policy which had dollars attached. And so in the 1998 election, there was a specific election commitment to produce a defence white paper in the second term of government after the 98 election. The need for that was highlighted especially by two events which Michael touched on. The first, both related to Australia's immediate neighbourhood. Partly because of what happened after 9/11. John Howard's reputation, if I can put it this way, as a foreign policy and strategic policy practitioner tends to focus a lot on his willingness to go to other parts of the world, like the Middle East. But I must say what struck me at the time, and I think what is clear from the record as it stands today, is that the real Howard doctrine, of that stage at least, was a very strong commitment to Australia's role of leadership in the immediate neighbourhood. He had a very clear sense, I think, if I may be so bold, in going back to the World War II experience of the islands, as that generation called them, that this was a part of the world that Australia could never take its eye off. Right at the beginning, he drove we officials to take a much more active approach to what we could be doing about Bougainville, and drove us through the process which eventually resulted in us deploying a substantial peace monitoring group to the peace process in Bougainville. And of course the sandline crisis that Michael mentioned. The thing that really struck me was how quickly and deeply Howard understood why the sandline crisis, which was a pretty wacky affair in its way, he saw clearly through all the muddle what was at stake for us, and was prepared to go a long way, further than I think we ever did. I had the sense he was prepared to go a very long way to make sure that Australia's interests were served. And that, of course, provided the framework in which he was then prepared to make such big commitments to East Timor, and later, of course, to Ramsey. That was a very consistent pattern. And it was that sense that we didn't necessarily have enough in the ADF to do what we might need to do in the immediate neighbourhood, which, even before East Timor, more than anything else, I think drove, so of those 4 shifts I mentioned, it was the first one of those that more than anything else drove the need to do a substantial rethink of our defence policy. And that was what brought us, of course, to the 2000 White Paper. As I say, the commitment to do a White Paper in 2000 was made in the 1998 election, before East Timor occurred. And I believe whatever had happened in East Timor, we still would have had the White Paper that we had in 2000, and it still would have been pretty much the same White Paper. It made it, that what had happened in East Timor, the profile that gave to the ADF, the way it made it vivid to people both around the cabinet table, amongst our colleagues in other departments of state, including the Treasury and Department of Finance, amongst others members of Parliament, and of course in the public, why the ADF was important. It made it easier to do what was done in the White Paper. I don't think it fundamentally changed the outcome. And the heart of the 2000 White Paper was very simple. The question that we posed to government was, do you want to be able to undertake a broader range of operations with the ADF beyond those conceived in the traditional DOA policy that you inherited from Labor? If so, are you prepared to do more, spend more, to acquire those capabilities? And we had 2 hints on that. The first was Howard's long-term commitment to sustaining defence spending at 2% of GDP. There's nothing magic, of course, about the number of 2% of GDP, but Howard had a fairly long-standing commitment to that. He'd used that phrase publicly, and because the economy in those days was growing at about 3% per annum, that meant we had about 3% per annum real growth to play with. So there was something to work with there. We weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper. But we were never going to see a sustained increase in defence spending of the sort that would be, I thought at least at the time, required to meet the more demanding strategic circumstances we were facing, if we just bargained on that. We had to present an argument as to why that was necessary. And the argument was reasonably straightforward. If we wanted the ADF to be able to meet those increasing strategic demands that I mentioned, we were going to have to develop it in 2 new directions. The first was an increased capacity to deploy and sustain relatively large light land forces beyond the continent within our immediate neighbourhood for protracted operations and the sorts of things that we did in East Timor, eventually ended up doing in Ramsey, could well have ended up doing in the PNG had sandline crisis played out the other way. And the second was we needed to develop our higher end capabilities, particularly our air and maritime capabilities, to operate beyond the narrow defence of Australia, to operate more effectively in coalition with our allies in the wider region, and to increase their capability levels to keep up with the increasing technological sophistication of capabilities around the region. And so the capacity to meet those sorts of demands in future was going to depend on the government's willingness to spend the money required. Cut a long story short, after I think a very complex, comprehensive process of policy analysis, the Howard government, Howard himself, agreed to something which had never been done before in peacetime, and that is to commit to sustain the increases in defence spending of 3% per annum over 10 years. And it was not just the 3% number, although that was nice, it was the 10 years that really made the difference. And that was a big decision, and we can say quite precisely it gave us the ADF we had today. It has a couple of specific points as well. A significant expansion of the Army was part of that. A decision to move to the 5th generation Joint Strike Fighter was part of that. The decision to make a major investment in the long-term naval capability, including submarine and surface ship capability, was part of that. And because of the way defence projects work, a lot of the things that we're dealing with today have their origins in that set of decisions that were made back in 2000. Of course, that was all before 9/11. And it was, and the way in which 9/11 impacted on that and changed the focus is, in a sense, a subject for another talk, perhaps next time. That might not be my turn. But there's a couple of points to make. The first is that despite the extraordinary importance that the war on terror, and particularly the commitment to Iraq and then Afghanistan, has had for Australia's approach to the alliance, the way we see ourselves in the world and so on, militarily the impact, at least on terms of our capability rather than the experiences of the members of the ADF, has not been that great. And that's because the actual scale of capabilities that Australia has deployed to those operations has been relatively small and hasn't fundamentally departed from the construct that was developed in the late 90s to meet the challenges that I set out. But politically, it made a big impact because that 9/11 was the point at which national security came right to the heart of the national conversation. As someone who'd spent quite a lot of their career trying to persuade my colleagues in the Treasurer's office to put just a sentence on defence in the budget speech, Peter Costello's 2002 budget speech, in which the first half of the entire budget speech was devoted to talking about national security before he even started talking about the economy, that was the sign of a fundamental change in the way Australia thought about its situation. I don't think it was just 9/11, by the way. I think that did reflect cumulative reflection of effects of other things, including East Timor itself. But that changed the national conversation about national security in ways that I don't think have yet been reversed. But I'd also make the point that I think the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, the commitment to Afghanistan, the way that's encouraged us to think about our situation, and to a certain extent the way it's encouraged us to think about the US alliance, has got in the way of responding to the fundamental challenges which the Howard government was really reacting to in those years between 1996 and 2000. What's happening in our immediate neighbourhood in the Southwest Pacific remains an absolutely central issue for Australia, and one which has the potential to make huge demands on the ADF, and I'm far from satisfied that the force we have today can meet it. And what's happening in our wider region with the rise of China, with China's challenge to the US-led order, which has been the foundation of Australia's security since the Second World War, that's a really big story, and we're just at the beginning of that one. Thank you very much.
We now have some time for questions. If you'd just like to raise your hand, wait till the microphone comes, tell us your name, and then we'll look forward to your question. Jerry.
Can you hear me? Yes, sorry. Jerry Wheeler. I thought that was a fantastic presentation, and congratulations to you and congratulations to the role that you played, particularly in relation to the 2000 White Paper. I just want to fill in a couple of the blanks. You mentioned Defence of Australia. East Timor demonstrated to Australians that the concept of defence of Australia failed and that previous white papers failed. And the reason why I say that was just in a pure capability perspective. We didn't have any way of, landing a large force. We had no amphibious capability. So what did we do? We leased a ferry and we painted it grey. We didn't have the protection of those ships in, capable destroyers. So we had to literally borrow an American one. And we had logistical problems that were not adequately provided for in previous white papers. And what the importance of the 2000 Defence White Paper, it ruled a line and said, enough is enough. And, what we got out of the defence, that 2000 White Paper, and congratulations for the role that you played in that, was, these magnificent capabilities in the landing helicopter dock. At last, a capability that could land a significant expeditionary force. And this is a capability that is the biggest naval vessel Australia has ever possessed. We got the Air Warfare Destroyer, the first of which was only commissioned a month ago, which is the most potent naval capability Australia has ever possessed. And that is because of the 2000 White Paper. And the other great thing about the 2000 White Paper was that it was delivered. When the HMAS Hobart was commissioned last month, it marked, here was a white paper that was delivered. How many other white papers that governments deliver were not actually delivered? This one was, and this was to an enormous credit to Mr. Howard. And look, I acknowledge the important role that you played in the 2000 White Paper. And there's one other, if we look at this period involved. Yes. Okay, the question is this. Don't you think that the most important capability decision that Mr. Howard took in between 1997 and 2001 was to finally turn the dud subs of the Collins-class submarine into the most capable conventional submarine in the world by providing it with the combat system of the US Virginia class?
Well, a lot in that. Well, thank you for your kind observations, but I'm going to be ungracious enough to disagree with you on a couple of points. Look, we could spend all night talking about East Timor, but I just want to make this point. I don't agree that East Timor showed that the policy that we'd adopted up until then failed. We achieved our operational objectives and we achieved our strategic objectives in East Timor. That's the test. Now, we could easily have failed. We would have failed had Indonesia or TNI, not the same thing, had opposed us. And that was not a hypothetical possibility. But no conceivable Australian force structure built under any conceivable Australian defence policy at any credible level of defence spending would have given us the capacity to defeat TNI on East Timor had they chosen to oppose us. So I believe the capabilities we actually had on the day allowed us to do what it was we set out to do, and had the circumstances been different, then nothing we would have had would have made much difference. On the capability trajectory, I'm myself not, as it happens, the LHDs, I'd like to, well, no, I'm glad not to claim credit for the LHDs. There was money in the 2000 White Paper for a substantial amphibious capability. It was not at that stage identified in the form of two 27,000-tonne ships. I personally think that's a profoundly mistaken decision. Those ships are bigger than we need and we don't have nearly enough of them. I would myself have gone for 5 ships much closer to about a 10,000-tonne class because it gives you a lot more concurrency, which I think is more important. And I would certainly agree that one of the most, I actually think there were a lot of important decisions made in the lead up to the 2000 White Paper. The very strong commitment to an effective air-to-air refuelling capability was really critical. The decision to go ahead with an airborne early warning capability and the quality of that capability was really critical. I think both of those are really fundamental to our air capability. And I do think the work that the Howard government put in getting the Collins right was right. I'm not myself a great fan of the of the Virginia-class combat system, particularly not on a conventional boat. It uses too many megawatts for my taste. But I agree that that was a very important thing to do.
Other questions? I know that if the microphone were to come to Rick Smith, he'd probably want to ask you about the impact of the National Security Committee of Cabinet and how that made things different.
We probably, well, actually, this is not something I lightly do. I'd like to just slightly disagree with my boss there about the role of the National Security Committee. Sorry? Sorry? Look, one of the really significant innovations for Howard government was very early on, Howard started using the National Security Committee of Cabinet not just to deal, as it had under the Hawke and Keating years, with matters of very high classification intelligence issues, but as a real national security committee, and that did work very well. And I agree with Michael that it made a significant difference to the way in which national security questions themselves were managed. And for example, the way in which we managed the 2000 White Paper process, that could not have been done if we hadn't had the National Security Committee of Cabinet with real commitment to its functioning from the Prime Minister, providing a forum in which we could spend a long time, days and days, talking through the decisions that had to be made. It was less of a innovation in actual crisis management, because the Hawke and Keating governments in crisis management mode, for example in relation to Iraq 1990-91, what became Operation Desert Storm, did not use the standard cabinet system, but it functioned in a more informal way with meetings in the Prime Minister's office. Now, it was basically the same group of people, but instead of meeting on one side of that corridor, they were meeting on the other. My own experience of watching both at work is that I think in some ways the less formal meeting was more effective. I don't know whether Rick would agree with that. I felt the less formal meetings were more effective because they were quicker. And in a crisis, one of the things that goes wrong is that you can spend too much time sitting in a room chewing things over when what you really want to do is to get decisions, get out the door and start implementing. So personally, I think the National Security Committee was more important as a long-term policy forum than as a crisis management forum.
For the record, if I may, I have no problem with the National Security Cabinet.
And Rick would also want me to be even-handed to ask you a similar question to the one I asked Michael Wesley. My office in this building was once the office of David Fairbairn, who was the Minister for Defence. Since him, 40 years ago, there have been 20 Defence Ministers.
Yes.
There were 5 Defence Ministers in the Howard government.
Yes.
You spoke warmly of Ian McLaughlin, but at the end of the period that you reviewed, there'd been 3. Would you care to comment on the contrast between having 1 in DFAT and having 5 in Defence? And to make it a shorter answer, you may only care to talk about the first 3.
Look, I agree with Michael's basic point, that is, I don't think there's anything wrong with having ministers in their job for a long time. It's a tough gig. There's a lot to learn, and in some ways you might say in defence in particular there's a lot to learn. You know, I think Labor benefited enormously from the fact that they had Kim in the job for, 6 years, and then Robert Ray in the job for 7 years. They were both very effective ministers anyway, but I think that made a huge difference. And I think one of the deficiencies we've had in the quality of defence policy in recent years, I'm even going to say longer than that, has been that we've seen people go in and out of the portfolio too often. But I would just make 2 further points. The 2 ministers that I worked for as an official under John Howard, Ian McLaughlin and John Moore, I both found in their very different ways, very different personalities. They were both very effective ministers, and I must say I found them very good to work with. And it might be worth saying, particularly I found them very good to work with, considering the fact that they took one look at me and said, this bloke used to be a Beazley and a Hawke staffer, and I still found them extremely good to work for. So I think either of them, had they been given longer in the portfolio, would weigh more heavily in the history of Australian defence policy than they do.
Last chance. Any questions before we finish? No? Please join with me in thanking Hugh for his presentation.